Money FM 89.3, the best of the afternoon update. The Afternoon Update with Lynlee Foo.
Money FM 89.3. Welcome to Industry Insight. I'm Lynlee. Now, when people think about real estate, offices and shopping malls usually come to mind. But across Asia Pacific, investors are increasingly looking at what we call the living sectors, from multifamily housing and co-living to student accommodation, senior living, and even hotels. To help us unpack why these sectors are gaining so much attention, I'm joined in the studio by Lynlee Foo, Senior Director at Savills Asia Pacific Capital Markets, who leads the firm's strategy in this space. Lynlee, great to have you with us.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
Lynlee, let's start with the big picture. Why are investors increasingly turning their attention to living assets?
It's a question I get asked very often. The living sectors have undergone enormous change over the last decade. And for Asia Pacific, the time is sort of now for when this change is really, really occurring. So living sectors used to be termed alternative sectors in real estate, but they're very much now being thought of as mainstream. And there are certain reasons as to why this is. But really it comes down to the resilient nature of living sectors. And in certain economic times as we are now, that's really encouraging investors to look towards them. They essentially, I suppose, are inelastic. Housing demand is inelastic. You know, hotels, retail, office, they are very cyclical markets. But living sectors, everyone always needs a place to live. So no matter what's going on in the world, people always need housing. And also behind this, we've got some extraordinary structural demographic tailwinds that are underpinning the sector. So across Asia Pacific in general, and I'll dig down a bit to Singapore later, is general population growth, aging population, later household formation, housing affordability issues. These are all pushing people to look towards the rental sector as opposed to the traditional model of buying a house when you're young. Mm-hmm. So as a result, there's an increased demand for rental housing, and therefore investors are seeing the long-term potential in this as an asset class.
Right. It's hard to imagine demand for these needs ever going away, and that must be reassuring for investors who've seen a lot of volatility in other parts of the market. Lynlee, the term living sectors covers quite a wide spectrum. So which segments are showing the strongest momentum right now?
Yeah, so we kind of go through the life cycle from student accommodation all the way up to senior living. And the thing with Asia Pacific and it being quite early stages in the living sectors, it's very nuanced across the region in different countries. So Japan, for example, is a very mature market. It's actually the largest multifamily market outside of the US. So it's a very, very deep market there. And we see a lot of core investors have been spending a lot of capital in Japan over the last decade. Australia is a very growing market, particularly in the build-to-rent space. So that's where we're seeing investors partnering with development partners and developing out multifamily assets. Student accommodation is something that's extremely in demand, particularly in Australia, where international students are driving demand for purpose-built student accommodation. And really that underlying student demand is very, very resilient, particularly during volatility. In the more emerging markets, such as Hong Kong, Korea, and we'll put Singapore in that bracket, co-living is really what's leading the charge. Co-living kind of sits between student accommodation and multifamily. So they're typically smaller room sizes. They're typically aimed at young professionals or even students. They have short lease terms, so they really kind of provide a flexible option for young professionals to live. And so we're seeing big growth in these emerging markets. And actually, it leads into another interesting trend that we're seeing, which is repurposing of undervalued assets. So in Singapore and Hong Kong in particular, undervalued office or non-prime hotels are being repurposed into co-living because actually the demand for co-living is so much stronger.
So I wanted to talk to you about that because there's a new market report here in Singapore, right, showing that foreign students, as you mentioned, now make up a sizable share of co-living demand, and operators are tailoring flexible leases to fit academic calendars. So with that in mind, could you help us clarify what sets the broader living sector apart from co-living and what makes co-living unique within that mix?
Yeah, so co-living is a subsector of living sectors. But you've hit on a really important point, which is that it's the term co-living can mean something very different to one market than it does in another. So typically, say, for example, in Australia, co-living is a form of, I suppose, multifamily, whereby the flexible lease terms are anything from 3 months plus, whereas typical multifamily will be a 2-year lease. So I suppose in Singapore, we would define co-living as 2-month, 3-month plus lease terms. We've also got to define that against service apartments, and the lease terms on them are a lot shorter. And then we've seen the government in Singapore try to define that with their regulations on the use class of service apartment A and 1 and 2. And the lease term plays a big part of that, because ultimately co-living shouldn't be viewed as serviced apartments. It's for more permanent living, but with an element of flexibility. And more importantly as well with co-living, it's the sense of community and amenity that is provided, as well as just 4 walls to live in.
Most importantly, for investors, does co-living offer higher yields?
Because it's a slightly newer concept, yes, it has produced higher yields than, say, the more established markets of student accommodation and multifamily. I would say, though, that over the last few years where the market has matured and investors have become more comfortable, we've seen those returns start to compress. And so investors are taking less of an opportunistic view, more of a sort of value add and core view at co-living. So I think, again, as the market continues to mature and grow, which it certainly will, I think we'll start to see those return hurdles come down in co-living.
Great. And in many Asian societies, Emily, families have traditionally cared for aging parents at home, but with urban lifestyles and demographic pressures, do you see that mindset changing in terms of senior living? And what could that shift mean for the growth of this sector, the senior living sector in the region?
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. And I think part of the transformation of living sectors and the growth of it in Asia Pacific relies upon a slight cultural shift in terms of how people view how they live, because you do have the generation living more so in Asia than you do, say, in UK, Europe and the US. But what you can't deny is the ageing population, like we see in Singapore, that the ageing population will reach 25% by 2030. And there's even more staggering figures in Korea and Japan. So there will be a need to cater for that part of the population. What's really encouraging from particularly the Singaporean government is they are looking ahead and seeing how to plan for this. And I particularly kind of like how they're trying to create mixed age communities where they can kind of replicate that generational living, but in a larger scale.
Okay, so it's not just a cultural conversation, it's also becoming a real estate and investment one.
Absolutely.
Okay, so when you look across Asia Pacific, where are the hotspots right now?
Good question. It's what a lot of my clients, we work on behalf of for breadth of clients, from sovereign wealth, pension funds, all the way through to family offices and private capital. And their question tends to be, we completely get the fundamentals of living sectors in Asia. We understand the demographics are there. Where should we be investing? For core investors that want to acquire stabilised assets with income in a very proven market, Japan tends to be the first port of call. So multifamily in Japan, we see lots of portfolios trading. Investors are able to acquire scale, which is really key, particularly for global institutions. But cap rates are low and growth is fairly flat. So that's really for long-term core buyers. Australia, I'd say, is probably the next really emerging sector in the region. Student accommodation is probably the hot spot there, but co-living is really growing, particularly in Sydney CBD. For Australia, access to Sydney is absolutely key. We've seen a lot of supply come on in Melbourne and to some extent Brisbane, and for anyone that can access living opportunities within Sydney will be very, very successful. I'd say South Korea, the ageing population there would lead to a very strong investment dynamic for senior living. But there it really requires, and this is an important point, partnership with local operators and boots on the ground is really, really key for incoming investors, because navigating new market and a new sector in that market, you really need local experience. So we're seeing investors say to us, okay, we'd like to do career senior living. Can you partner us up with a local partner? And we want a 25% share in their opco. So we're seeing a lot of investors kind of wanting that share in the operational businesses as well. So that's probably another key focus. And then I'd say co-living in Singapore is another real hotspot. We've seen big growth in that sector, about 17% growth from 2023 to 25. So that growth is going to continue, particularly when we see the government regulations really backing that growth as well. So I'd say they're the areas to look out for, but there's unlimited opportunity across the region.
Any other Southeast Asian markets to, keep an eye on?
Yeah, I think co-living will lead the way in Southeast Asia, because with that kind of repurposing angle of undervalued office assets or hotels, I think that will probably be the pattern we see across Southeast Asia.
Okay. Well, I think that really underscores how fragmented Asia Pacific can be. Every market has its own rule book.
Yeah,
almost.
absolutely.
Emily, how are institutional investors rethinking their portfolios with these living assets in mind?
I'd say generally there is and we've talked about the kind of demographic fundamentals and tailwinds behind the sector. I'd say there's just a general shift towards living sectors generally in the region. These investors tend to be over-allocated to the traditional asset classes, so they're looking to living sectors for diversification, and as well that counter-cyclical nature of living sectors, what's really driving them towards that as well. There are some headwinds and some barriers, and I suppose the key one of that is scale. These investors need significant scale to move the needle for them, really. And the difficulty is that a lot of these assets aren't yet built in the region, so it requires quite a long-term view to look through the planning, the development process to reach those stabilised assets. So I think that's where it comes back to partnership with local operators and developers that can achieve those results for these investors, but with a long-term strategy. So I think investors looking at this as a kind of long-term defensive strategy, just given the fundamentals behind the sector.
Okay, one thing's for sure, though, living sectors are reshaping how portfolios are being built.
They certainly are, and I think we'll start to see some success from investors that have specific living strategies and make it their real focus, and we're starting to see that. And, I think as well, what's important is we're seeing investors look at living sectors across the capital stack, all the way from equity up to credit as well, and seeing how they can get involved across the capital stack. And that's where Savills will be active as well with Savills Capital Advisory. So that's something to look out for as well. I think because it's nuanced across the region and it's a new sector, it does require a bit of structuring and imagination of how to kind of access. It's not so simple as acquiring a stabilised office asset or an industrial building with a 10-year lease on it.
Not so simple, yet you've recently taken on this regional leadership role at Savills.
Right.
How is the firm helping clients capture opportunities in this space? What's your KPIs for now?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So I recently just joined Savills in this role, and one reason I really wanted to do that was because Savills have a market-leading living sectors team in the UK and Europe, where the markets are much more mature and they trade high volumes of living sectors from student all the way up to senior. So we really want to kind of leverage on that experience. And as well, what's kind of really relevant is that our clients that are investing in that region are the same that are investing in this region. So we want to help them kind of come across into Asia Pacific and help them on that journey as they become global living investors. Where we can really help, and it's in my role in the regional perspective, we've got excellent capital markets brokers around Asia, from Japan, Korea, here in Singapore and Australia. And I work really closely with those teams on the ground to uncover opportunities. So I'll understand exactly what our investors are looking for, and then I'll work closely with my teams to make sure we're uncovering those assets for them. Because as I say, it's a tightly held market, and it's a small market at the moment, which is highly sought after. So uncovering those assets is really what we can do for our clients, as well as shaping their strategies with our intelligence and our research.
I suppose in Europe, your operational capital markets team, they're quite active in living sectors, aren't they?
Absolutely active, yeah. They've traded about 24 billion in transactions over the last 2 years. Okay. It's actually living sectors in the UK was the most traded sector last year compared to traditional asset classes. So, yeah, we'll rely on that team, partly because, their experience as well, but also I think Asia can learn a lot from those more westernised markets that have been through this growth journey. The UK was a very, very small market only 5-7 years ago, and it's seen huge growth over the last 5 years. So we kind of look back and think, okay, what journey have they gone on, and how can we shape our strategies for our clients over that same time period and see how that might play out. Obviously, there are big differences in the region and it won't be the same, but there'll certainly be lessons to learn.
Okay, and looking ahead, what will shape the living sectors in this region, in Asia Pacific, over the next decade?
I think the major shapers, we've touched on some of them. I think the cultural shift is something that will be kind of important, but I think it's happening anyway. Not only kind of, demand from Singapore for co-living, it isn't just international students and expatriates. It's also young professionals as well that want that flexibility, want to live centrally, want that kind of community and amenity space. So I think that cultural shift is happening, but that needs to come on a bit of a journey. What will support that and what it needs as well is government change and government regulation to make sure that planning is supportive, tax reforms are supportive, and so that there is the ability to change. Australia is going through a big change in terms of that at the moment, particularly. I think some issues we'll see, maybe perhaps is the high construction costs is going to be an issue that investors will have to get around, and pricing of these assets, given their resiliency, is tight. So that may hinder progress somewhat, but it's undoubtable that the next decade will be transformational.
What about sustainability?
That's a huge part. Yeah, we haven't touched on that, but I think when we think about repurposing assets that are no longer fit for purpose, office is going through huge change at the moment, and my colleagues in the office sector won't thank me for saying that. But we know that there's a way to repurpose assets, and Singapore government has been particularly proactive in encouraging that as well with some of their assets. And so the more of that, I think that's really where the opportunity will come, and that again will tick the box for a lot of institutional investors who are driven by these ESG criteria.
So it sounds like the future isn't just about growth, it's about making these communities more sustainable, I suppose inclusive and future ready.
Absolutely. I think kind of that creation of community is actually, we can think about the high level numbers and the returns and what the investor wants, but kind of community creation and how actually people want to live in the future is really, really critical. So it feels like a bit of a turning point in the region in terms of governments embracing that. And, I love what Singapore are doing with their across the spectrum communities. That's brilliant. Hopefully will be a bit of a blueprint.
Emily, thank you so much for those insights. It's clear the living sectors are moving from the sidelines to the center of Asia Pacific real estate, and the opportunities are just, starting to grow.
Yes.
Emily, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate you coming into the studio and joining us today.
Pleasure to spend time with you. Thank you.
Emily Foo, Senior Director at Savills Asia Pacific Capital Markets, here on Industry Insight. I'm Lynlee.
To listen to more great interviews, download our podcasts at audio.sg or download the audio app. That's AWEDIO, audio at the App Store and Google Play.